Good morning. This is your host, Llorraine Neithardt, and you've reached Venus Unplugged from New York City. And what we do here, I am kind of a therapist, psychic with a twist. I work with the principles of AION and fairy tale, and of course my natural gift as a clairvoyant. And what we've been exploring for a couple of years now is the archetype of Aphrodite, the archetype of Venus and Eros. Because in this culture we crucify beauty and truth and relatedness. So I want to explore here how psyche works, how the unconscious works, what the principles are, and so we can have a better understanding that psyche rules. Whatever we don't know about ourselves does return to us as fate. And so I'm going to do a little review here since it's September and it's review time. And let me see, on Thursday we're going to have the equinox, autumn equinox. So what happens then is there is a balancing. So there's a natural balancing within our own selves. For those of you that are into the esoteric language, that is also a time of purification and cleansing. So if some negative forces have been sent your way, or you feel that, equinoxes are the time when those forces get cleansed, and we don't have to take them for another half a year. Okay. So, but what we're looking at now is one of Jung's finest books. Even though there's a lot of yakking and Jungian talk and stuff, I think his philosophy and he's just starting to be understood because he demands contribution. Of course, as a man, there's, as with all of us, lots of failures, but also tremendous contribution. All right? So, first and foremost, understanding that there are always forces at work which we have no knowledge of, but we're playing out nonetheless. And these are they work out in history, as well as those forces are not the gods, as we call them, or the archetypes, but they were nonetheless powers, and they are powers. So that statement, what goes around comes around, that's actually the law of balance. It has nothing to do with punishment. It is a balancing. And there's particular balancing on this Thursday with the equinox. So and the balancing is cause and effect. We reflect, oh my goodness, I saw it this way, and I'm going to go over a little bit of review on the ego and the shadow, so we can start to understand these principles that we all are working with. And what is consciousness? Consciousness is the awareness that we are unconscious. That's what consciousness is. So even, if we make the slightest effort to become aware of what we don't know about ourselves, we certainly can clearly see it in our enemy or in our strangers or in our loved ones, but not always so much in ourselves. And that's important to understand. There before the grace of God go I. So we, as human beings, the royal we, I suppose, is somewhere between fate and destiny, right? So, and then we have justice, which is kind of consequences or retribution, all right? So fate is when, it's what we're born with. There wasn't choice. It's kind of where we were born and what it was about, and we're presented with this by the gods. Our family of origin, the culture that we're born into, genetic inheritance. None of this is a choice. And yet there's a certain destiny. The destiny is what we do with it. And the destiny is how we carry out one's fate. So those are the two extremes, fate given by the gods. Destiny expresses itself, how we express ourselves with that destiny. And the human character is somewhere bouncing in between these two extremes. So within the state of human character, there are other characteristics. One of the big ones that we're into these days, and we're watching it par excellence, is hubris. Another word for it is inflation. All right, and it's very easy to fall into it, particularly if we're not aware that the ego is just part of the whole personality. The ego gets inflated. It's almost like a blister. It rubs the wrong way, and then we get a boo-boo, and it swells, and we're in this, and it gets busted in order to get healed. So there's the ego has a tendency towards presumption, right? And the presumption of the ego makes frequently and that it knows who it is. I am, therefore I am. But it doesn't know about the unconscious. There is the personal unconscious, and that's with the author of all of that, what goes on in our life. And then there's the personal unconscious, just has a lot to do with how we're carrying out our life and what we're, choices that we're making. Now, the collective unconscious is pretty much the same. So that's the kind of early and primitive forces. By primitive, it doesn't mean less than. More potent, I suppose, is a better word. And so when the ego says, I'm running the show here, and there's a tendency for the ego to kind of privilege its own position, to value its choices, but the problem with the ego, it is often doesn't know enough to know it doesn't know enough. So it's the interplay of all these forces every day in every way, and even while we're sleeping, that really is what the human condition is about. And it's really, on one level, it can feel daunting. On another level, it is so profound, and we're somewhere between those levels. So it's like the fate that you was handed is Apollo. But the hand that wounded you is your own. And so when people say, what they don't know doesn't hurt, wrong. It hurts a lot. It comes back, not in revenge, just in it's like swings back. And if there's nothing like human character in between these two swings to judge and understand and determine, we get pulled to and fro with all of these opposites. So in trying to understand where we are, and particularly now, it really is a huge call towards moral character. And that's pretty much what the Jungian philosophy is about, is, that to become whole is a moral responsibility, or to become mature. You don't hear that word a lot. It's probably considered old-fashioned, but it has great value. And it doesn't happen automatically. Now, life inherently teaches, and not everyone has the time or can make the effort to do a therapy or to do work. So, but by asking ourselves the questions, which we do, and the question is not, why has this befallen me? The question usually has to do with what is the task that my soul requires of me? Or what is the task that life requires of me, this situation? And we look at it not from the eyes of a child or from the eyes of the ego, which always stands first and says, no, I'm right. And everyone else is wrong, or can't stop and say, well, let me just observe this, or let me reverse it. That's where Jung created active imagination, where we give voice to the opposing forces that are going on in our head. We write one thing down, and then we write the next thing down, and we start to see, wow, that is a very deep struggle. And if it gets really strong, then we're in a state of utter chaos. And all of that contributes to what's going on in the outer world, because this is also going on in the inner world, the interplay. So the components of the ego are the ego's nature in and of itself in every human being is the same, but the difference is that the components have our clarity, our emotional coloring, our what Jung calls types, the thinking type, feeling type, intuitive type, sensate type. These are all what make the kind of the design of the ego, but the central structure of it, it is individual, all right? And the ego, as a point of reference, has a very significant part to play. It's not surprising that the prejudice of it being the center of the personality, and that has flourished for a very long time in history, but it's just the center of the personality. But once we are truly aware, this is the important part, and this is also the thrust of Venus Unplugged, is that once the existence of a psyche outside of consciousness is realized by experience, the absolute position of the ego becomes relative. And I guarantee you the ego does not like that. So that is also called the midlife crisis, which can happen pretty much midway, so it doesn't have to be a chronicle midway. It also can be the midway between a problem. We hit the crisis point. The same thing happens in a dream. We build the psyche gives us the storyline, the commentary on what's going on inside, and then there's a crisis in the dream, and then the last part of the dream hints at resolution. So, like I said, even if we're not working, we are being worked. That's what psyche does. Because the job of psyche is to get us to our wholeness. And considering we all live somewhere between here and eternity, we have eternity. So there's no timeline. But it certainly makes life more interesting if we consider that the ego plays an important part, but it really is not God. It is the choices that we make. And when we're not in complete relationship, seeing all the aspects, the ego will have us fly into hubris, inflation, my way or the highway. I can do this all. I can stand before ancient laws and disrespect them all. I can drive in the opposite lane. I can drive drunk. So in a sense, when we're in an inflated ego, it's drunk driving. And there's lots of accidents caused. Now, the drunk driver may get out unscathed, but if he looks around, really looks, reflects, this causes a lot of hurt and misunderstanding in the human condition. So we're trying here at Venus Unplugged to give some understanding to be able to discern what are these different aspects. Was that my ego, the false ego? Was that in relationship to the task that my soul requires of me? At what position was my shadow standing? And the shadow, that represents pretty much what we don't know about ourselves. It's not negative or positive. It certainly can have that outcome, but it is more about the shadow is really kind of what the moral problem of our life is. We don't want to see. We can, as I say, we can. That's projection. We can clearly see the folly in another person or the tragic flaw in another something outside of ourselves. But it's a little more difficult to turn that around and say, well, where is that flaw in me, and how is that living in me, unbeknownst? And that's when we start, really gets interesting. I can't say that it's comfortable, but it becomes interesting because that's rich and powerful. And that's also why we have art and poetry and literature and known or unknown, we're working out those forces. So becoming terms, with the shadow is a lifetime task. There's no I've done the shadow work. No, you haven't. It's every day. I mean, you may have done some work and you're some aware, but it's not something. It's a constant in our life, and also that's what I think really gives the richness and the meaning to life. It's kind of the plot. People resist the concept of hell, which there's no literal hell, but that's kind of the hell is the place where the shadow lives and breathes and has its being, and we can start to it's hell because we don't have an awareness of it. We refuse it. But there's a lot of teaching. There's a lot of teaching from the center of the earth. There's a lot of growth with light. We come from a different light, the shadow light. So it's really painful, the shadow. But once we're able to face it, we can really begin to develop. Now, we don't face it straight on, directly, headlights towards it. It's more through reflection. And reflection is asking our question. And the question is not, why did this happen to me? That's not so kosher. That's a question from the ego, or that's the question that the child asks. And the child can't. The child is too busy, and that's the rightful place of developing an ego. So the more Venusian way is to ask, what is the task that my soul requires of me? How do I learn how to love? People, so fascinating, have all these lists and about what they want in love and what the person is supposed to be, and very rarely do I hear the other side, which is, well, what are the actions that you're taking to be that person that you want that other person to be, or how are you going to meet that person? It's they sit on one side of the fence and suffer instead of saying, okay, if I want to meet somebody interesting, I will do something interesting and meet people and strangers. I mean, that's great that there's this computer stuff, but that causes a lot of anxiety and tension. There's lots of people. The world's overpopulated, so there's no shortage of people. There's shortage of people who, just are going to fulfill our wishes. What are we, who is the one, and I don't feel there's just one. There can be many soulmates, soul friends. If we're not in a personal relationship or a romantic relationship, then really put some effort into your friendships and develop the union in that way. There's always the other. And we know that with our pets, and that with our families, there's the other. And so if we don't have that personal relationship, well, we still can develop until that one kind of comes along, or we figure out, how we can be in a position to meet new people. So with the shadow, so the real difficulty is the emotion that's attached to the shadow. And that emotion is not an activity of the individual, but something that happens to him when his adaptation is the weakest and causes obsessions and even possessions. So your shadow plays a great part because that's where we're oversensitive, where someone would say something, it's like, oh, how could you possibly say that about me, blah, 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 blah. And, but it's true. And there's this deep kind of like an aerosol cannon of fire reaction, and everything blasts. It's like that deep overreaction. Somewhere there's shadow. So it's not blame. It's the contributing factor. So the ego gets very offended. Not my fault. Well, it's not a matter of fault. It's a matter of dynamics. It's a matter of yin and yang. It's a matter of balance. So, but the difference, and however, when we're kind of becoming differentiated or a little more civilized, we may be in consciousness, we all have these kind of primitive forces, envy being one of the biggest ones, who are the passive parts of us. And so the unconscious and the collective unconscious is not capable of moral judgment. It's not interested in that. The archetypes of the gods are not into human morality. That they're gods. And in a way, there are some beliefs that the gods envy humanity because we have some free will. They don't have free will. Apollo has to be Apollo, Aphrodite has to be Hera has to be Hera. The archetypes have to live according to their nature. There's no switcheroo. So when we have the shadow, a good deal of the shadow is it's easy to find. It's also very painful. And when we assimilate it, the parts that are projected are often incredibly obstinate. Like, no, that's not me, that's that other. So what Jung says is that, the understanding our projections, which is when we can't integrate the shadow, we're going to project it out in the world. It's their fault. Or the victimization. But what Jung says, and I agree with 1,000%, is that it's a moral achievement that goes far beyond the ordinary when we take up the task. And one of the best books, really, on shadow is Robert Johnson's Owning Your Shadow. I mean, I love all his books because he takes these rather complex concepts because we have to live them. Just because you can say it doesn't mean you're experiencing it. You need to really live this stuff. And what projections do, they isolate us by surrounding us with this veil of delusion that obscures reality entirely. So we would see that as illusion, Maya, Neptune. So let's say, for example, someone could never admit that they're wrong. They always find, and usually a superior reasoning for, no, I'm absolutely right. So when you get so caught, and I'm not saying that you can't be truly right, but when that happens, you can also say, okay, I understand this, but I can also see how this could be perceived this way. So it's not about that right or wrong, because then we're on one side of the scale and not the other. And the balancing of the shadow is somewhere in between. Yes, I understand it, but I too am capable of. How many people don't even realize that they're murdering their soul by their behavior? And then when they wake up 4 o'clock in the morning, devastated And, that's who you are at that 4 o'clock in the morning. That's the facing off. That's when the real conversation begins. Or you wake up with this devastating loneliness that cannot be filled. You don't try to fill it with others. You have that conversation with the loneliness. What is the longing? Or is this a time of grief or a time of suffering that one must consciously suffer? Feeling the boo-boo, feeling what's going on. So let's say somebody will say, I could never admit that I wasted the first 35 years of my life just noodling around. But if we can say that, it's not a waste. The realization doesn't make it a waste. It says, I was stumbling, and it was folly, and I was a bit of the divine fool, and I was struggling, and I really believed the branding that if I do this, this, and this, according to the collective, I will get this results. All right? And usually by the time 35 hits, we pretty much realize, well, that isn't always true. And even if it is true, it's about ready to change. And we see it as life sucks. No, it doesn't. We just have to turn it on and use that energy and reflect. So the great difficulty in realizing the shadow lies in its becoming contaminated by the anima and the animus. And those are the two inner contrasexual figures. All right. So if you're female and you're dreaming of females, not only is that your shadow, because your shadow always shows up in the same sex as the dreamer, but if a male dreams of a female, that very often indicates his anima figure, his inner female. And when a woman dreams of a man, very often that is her. Like you can have a dream, there's a man who's very helpful in the dream, and there's a man who's not very helpful in the dream, and you're struggling with the dream. So it's showing you that there's an animus struggle. There is one masculine principle that is for us and working towards our greater good, and there's one that's working against. So that's part of seeing the enemy within. Where did, it's like, damn, I did it again. I wasn't going to say anything. I was going to learn how to keep a secret, and I spilled the beans. Or when people can't keep contained, which is what a secret is. I'm not talking about toxic secrets that poison us. Those should be absolutely either written down or shouted out. But the secrets of the containment, or somebody says, can you keep a secret? No. Say no, even if you can, because what you're saying is, would you do me a favor and hold my shadow, because I can't keep a secret, so I'm going to pass it on to you. Don't fall for it. Say no, you were given the task of keeping that information or that event secret and sacred. You hold it. I am not picking that up. I got my own to deal with. So much, and I really feel there's an incredible, do I feel it? I see it, this incredible acceleration of consciousness is going on, which is what the chaos is about. Enormous amount of creativity, enormous amount of Venus is really being kicked up, so we can start understanding. So till next week, and we're going to go over the synergies, which is the anima and the animus, and start to work with these principles in our life. And so what is the task that your soul requires of you is a good way to start the morning. Or what is the task I'm avoiding? That's the first, what Jung would always wonder when someone came into therapy. Be like, what's the task that this Alessandra is avoiding? And what are the traits or the petty beliefs? What's going on here? Or the tyrannical fears we love more than life. So let us sacrifice our tyrannical fears for the pain of becoming. It's worth it. It's birth pains, birth pangs. So till next week, Venus Unplugged, and I am also transforming. I suppose transforming is kind of a Jungian truth. I'm putting former episodes on YouTube to open up this information to the world. Bye-bye.